So hi and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction. We're looking at Joyce's collection of short stories, Dubliners. We've just finished T.S. Eliot's poem, The Waste Land, and the short story we'll start off with today is something called Araby, which is obviously from the collection Dubliners. Before we dive into the text, just some little summary about the collection as a whole. So what kind of short stories constitute this collection, Dubliners? So as the very name suggests, this is about Dublin, the city in which James Joyce wrote these short stories, the setting of these stories, as in Ulysses, which is this novel, which we'll do in due course of time. But this is essentially about the decadence of Dublin. This is essentially about a jobless Dublin. It's about a Dublin which is alcoholic, alienated, obviously part of the empire, the British Empire. But you know, this English-Irish tension is very much there, especially in this particular short story towards the end, where we find that there is this mention of the English accent and how the English accent is distinctly different from the Dublin accent, and how that is not just an accent but a status marker, a cultural marker, so to say. Right, so it is about the John Dee's situation of Dublin. It's a dead and decaying city. The church, the Catholic Church over here, is a very decadent institution. It's coming to a natural death, and you know, everything around it, the faith system, the belief system, things which sustain the citizens of Dublin, they all come to an end, so to say. Now, in this particular setting, we have this story about a fantasy. It's about a romantic fantasy about a boy, by a boy, an unnamed boy, who has this fantasy for a girl. He's also unnamed, but she's just called Mangan's sister, right? So Mangan's sister becomes his object of desire for the boy. And Araby in the story is basically about a bazaar. It's about this Oriental bazaar in Dublin, where the different merchandise, different kinds of markets from the Orient would be brought to be sold in that particular bazaar. So in that sense, it becomes a very exotic space. It becomes a colonial space, and it's a space where the boy goes in a quest to get his perfect gift for his beloved. So, you know, as in Ulysses, there is also this mythic substructure in this particular story. It's about a quest to get the ideal gift, the chalice, so to say, for the beloved. And the boy in the story is a knight in shining armor, the knight in the quest story, the quest narrative, who's going to that particular place to get that chalice, this immortal chalice of love and life, and bring it back to the, you know, his lady love. So that is the mythical subtext which is there underlying the story. But on the surface, this is very much a story about Dublin, early 20th century Dublin, which is, like I said, very, very decadent, very jaundiced, very, very diseased city. It is about jobless, drunkards, and dysfunctional families, and the failing and falling Catholic Church, which cannot contain the people at the level of faith and sustenance. So, as in most of Joyce's stories, there's a lot of symbolism in this particular story as well. So we need to pay very careful attention to certain symbolism, symbols around institutions and markers. And most of the symbols are about decadence, it's about deadness, it's about hypocrisy, sexual hypocrisy, moral hypocrisy, religious hypocrisy, etc. Right? So that symbolic structure, the symbolic mapping, or the mapping of symbols, is something which we should pay very close attention to as we move on with the story. So having given you a very brief outline, the summary, and the context in which the story emerges from, let's dive into the text and see where that takes us. So this is Araby by James Joyce, which should be on your screen. North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys free. So the very first sentence is quite loaded. As you can see, North Richmond Street being blind. So in the very beginning, we have this idea of the dead end. The blind street, something which doesn't take you anywhere, right? So the deadness of the street, the blindness of the street is quite symbolic in the sense of the directionlessness of the Irish society at that point in time. It was a quiet street except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys free. So you know, this little bit is also quite symbolic. The Christian Brothers School is obviously a religious institution, a Catholic school presumably. The only time that particular street became active and vibrant and had some life in it was when this Christian Brothers School set the boys free. So, you know, the whole idea of conveying the end of the school with the freedom of the boys, it just goes to show how this particular institution could be seen or was perceived by the boys as some kind of an imprisonment, right? And that again, in a more macro structure, it becomes quite dialogic with the Irish society of the time. Religion, obviously, over here becoming not a mode of liberation, but as a mode of imprisonment, something which is imprisoning you. It's setting you free at the end of the day, and only at the end of the day, when a Christian school set you free, do you have any amount of freedom to do something you like, right? So the Christian Brothers School obviously becomes a metaphor of imprisonment, spiritual imprisonment, moral imprisonment, and the blindness of the street is obviously a metaphor for deadness and blindness and directionlessness. It's a cul-de-sac, geographically speaking, but in a more symbolic level, it is actually about the blindness of the society as a whole. Okay, an uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end. The word blind comes again, at the blind end, detached from its neighbors in a square ground. The other houses of the street, conscious of decent lives within them, gazed at one another with brown, imperturbable faces. So the brownness and the imperturbable quality of the houses is obviously a very somber symbolism of the lack of warmth in this kind of a neighborhood. You know, they all gaze at each other with brown, imperturbable faces. Nothing can perturb them at any level of human engagement. And the irony is this degree of brownness and imperturbability is equated with decency. Right? So decency is equated with lack of warmth, with coldness, so to say. Okay, and the only other house which doesn't have this warmth is quite literally a dead house because it's uninhabited. So if you take a look at the symbolism in the very first paragraph of the story, we find it's littered with symbols of deadness, detachment, claustrophobia, etc. in jaundice situations. Blindness comes twice, detachment is depicted, and the fact that the only house which is not decent is uninhabited is obviously a symbol of a lack of life, the end of life, is the people have left the house, so to speak. Now, what kind of house was that? Why was it uninhabited? So what is the absence which is being pointed at? Because in Joyce, as in many other modernist texts, absence becomes a very potent pointer towards a certain kind of presence. So it's not really absence in the proper absence sense. It's an absence which indicates a former presence, a posthumous presence sometimes, a degree of spectrality, if you will. It's the end of something, but at the same time, it's also a reminder of what he used to be. Right? So absence in Joyce is something which we must pay careful attention to. So why is it that that particular house is uninhabited? And now we come back to the speaker's house, and there too we have a sense of deadness coming in. And how is that so? The former tenant of our house, a priest, had died in a back drawing room. So we have the image of the dead priest. Again, very, very symbolic. It's a deadness of religion which has been depicted over here. The death of the priest is a very symbolic death. If you read, for instance, Irish literature is full of priests. It's full of different kinds of missionary presences. So if you take a look at James Joyce's drama, Riders to the Sea, or even the Playboy of the Western World, we find that both are depicted, both are set in seaside setting and seaside conditions, in a very, very remote coastal conditions of Aran Islands. And over there, and especially in Riders to the Sea, we have the image of the young priest. And the youngness of the priest is in contrast to the agelessness of the sea. So the sea is ageless, the sea is timeless, the sea is almost mythical in quality, compared to which the priest in that particular drama, Riders to the Sea by James Joyce, the priest is young. So Christianity as religion is very, very young compared to the agelessness of the sea, so to speak. So over here, the dead priest becomes a very symbolic absent figure, right, or absent presence, so to speak. And now we find how the absent presence or the spectrality of the dead priest, it informs the spatiality, right? The space is informed by the spectrality, by the shadowy presence of deadness. And how's that so? And this should be on the screen as I go on reading. Air, musty from having been long and close, hung in all the rooms, and the waste room behind the kitchen was littered with old, useless papers. Right? So again, the whole idea of littering the kitchen with old, useless papers is interesting, and the sense of litter, the sense of trash, becomes important again. If you remember, quite a bit of Wasteland by Eliot is about urban trash. It's about the generation of trash, the production of waste, so to say, urban waste. And we have a similar kind of a waste symbolism over here, where the waste room behind the kitchen is littered with old, useless papers. So the sense of litter is important. If you remember Eliot's Preludes, it also had the image of the evening newspapers, and obviously the very definition of evening newspapers is stale news. It's something which has come to an end. It doesn't have any symbolic or commodity value anymore, right? So the old newspapers, the old useless papers over here are examples of litter, and that litter is obviously filling in the kitchen and the waste room adjacent to the kitchen. So among these, I found, and this is the first time the first person narrator is introduced, I found a few paper-covered books, the pages of which were curled and damped. The Abbot by Walter Scott, The Devout Communicant, and the Memoirs of Vidocq. I like the last best because its leaves were yellow. So Joyce is really a master in terms of focalization, right? So what is happening over here is the entire story is being focalized through an adolescent imagination, through a childlike imagination, right? So it's a child's eye which is telling you the story. It's the hand which holds the camera, so to speak, the narrator who's unfolding the story before you. And if you take a look at the cognitive bias at play over here, the narrator likes the last book best. For what reason? Not because of the content, but because the leaves were yellow. So this very childish reason to like a particular book is reflective of the narrator's imagination, the narrator's situatedness, or the narrator's maturity, right? And that's very deliberately presented to us because its immaturity will obviously, it will get converted into something else as the story progresses. But at this point in time, it is focalized to an immature imagination, something which is telling you that there are 3 books in front of me, and the names of the 3 books are A, B, and C, the Abbot, the Devout Communicant, and the Memoirs of Vidocq. I love the last one best because the pages were yellow colored. Right? It's a very childish reason to like a book, but that's precisely the point. That point is conveyed to us that the imagination of the narrator is very childish in quality. It's not really a mature imagination, right? Okay. The wild garden behind the house contained a central apple tree and a few straggling bushes, under one of which I found the late tenant's rusty bicycle pump. Now this is full of biblical and sexual imagery, and this is something which we find throughout Joyce's writing over, especially in Ulysses. The wild garden and the central apple tree are clearly biblical symbols, and a few straggling bushes around are obviously images of waste. It's not really a beautiful garden, it's not really a pretty garden, it's a wasted garden. It's a garden which is sort of coming to an end, which is full of litter. And in the bushes, under the few straggling bushes, the late tenant's rusty bicycle pump, a very phallic symbol. So again, it's a very decadent phallic symbol, rusty bicycle pump. And Joyce is full of, his writing is full of these symbolic, sexual symbolism and moral symbolism and religious symbolism, all put together in an entanglement which is very complex, but at the same time, it's very, very compelling. And this is part of the scandal he faced as a writer writing at that point in time. The fact that he very, very indiscriminately used sexual symbolism and religious symbolism together is something which shocked his contemporary moral demography, his moral imagination, which is something we find more pervasively in Ulysses. But here we find this Freudian symbol coming in, the tenant's rusty bicycle pump, juxtaposed with the central apple tree. Okay, he had been a very charitable priest. In his will, he had left all his money to institutions and the furniture of his house to his sister. So again, look at the irony at play. The first part of the sentence is interesting. He had been a very charitable priest. Nothing wrong with that. So a priest full of charity. And the next sentence, immediately, it has this very coded irony and packed into it. Why so? Because it is told to us in his will, he had left all his money. So the fact that his charity is defined by his possession of money. He's left all his money to institutions and the furniture of his house to his sister. So nothing really charitable about it, so to speak. And the very fact that he managed to make a lot of money, which has been indicated by all his money, is obviously undercutting any priestly charity he was supposed to have. So it's not really a life of renunciation. It's a life of acquisition, which he has left behind to his institutions and sister. Okay, so we have already had abundant examples of religious hypocrisy, sexual hypocrisy, and a general sense of decadence which is pervasive in Irish society. Right? And this particular cul-de-sac, this neighborhood, it stands for Dublin as a whole, and every little thing in that is a microcosmic example, so to say, of the decadence in Irish society, religious institutions failing you, the priests becoming hypocritical, and this very decadent sexual morality at play as well, right? And that's something which you find running throughout the story. Now, we move on, And then we have this description of space and how the sky and the space mix together to create a certain kind of affective condition. Okay, and we'll find example of children playing together, and the fact that so much time and space is spent over here describing children's playful activities is interesting, because the narrator will gradually move away from this, right? So he'll go through a metamorphosis of sort, while he will suddenly become very mature, and this maturity will come out of love. So this whole idea of love over here obviously is a very erotic event in this particular story, but the complexity of the story is the child, because of his Catholic upbringing, because of his deeply religious upbringing, will fail to acknowledge the erotic sentiments of love, the erotic component of love. It's something which is forbidden for him to even acknowledge it. So he'll couch it in religious metaphors, which makes it even more scandalous. He'll couch it in devotional metaphors, which will make it even more scandalous. But in his confused adolescent imagination, it is exactly how he'll couch it. So his erotic impulses will be couched and conveyed in very coded religious symbolism in this particular story. But let's take a look at how the children's playful activities are depicted to us at this section. When the short days of winter came, dusk fell before we had well eaten our dinners. This is obviously a dinner in a British Irish way, which is something, a meal that is had at the end of the day. The dusk fell well before we had eaten our dinners. When we met in the street, the houses have grown somber. Again, the ghostly quality is being depicted over here. Somber, spectrality is very, very spectral in quality, something shadowy and ghostly. Okay, the spacious sky above us was a color of ever-changing violet, and towards it the lamps of the street lifted their feeble lanterns. Right, so the feeble quality is interesting. There's a very feeble attempt to have any illumination in its darkness. Right, so everything is getting dark and somber, and the lanterns in the street are just very feeble compared to the darkness that is very quickly falling in the streets. The cool air stung us, and we played till our bodies glowed. Our shouts echoed in the silent street. The career of our play brought us through the dark, muddy lanes behind the houses, where we ran the gauntlet of the rough drives from the cottages, to the back doors of the dark, dripping gardens, where odours arose from the ash pits, to the dark, odorous stables, where a coachman smoothed and calmed the horse that shook music from the buckled harness. Right, so again, if we take a look at the very sensory movements over here, they're very, very interesting. The sense of touch, the sense of smell, the sense of sight, they all combine together to describe the career of play. So what has been described to us is a very physical, geographical activity. It's a movement of boys in a particular neighborhood. But the way it's depicted to us, it's very clear that it's very, very sensory in quality, and the focus is on the senses. And that's something which is very, very modernist. In terms of representation and politics, the whole thing is about consciousness, how you perceive the external reality around you. And I'm sure all of us by now, at this point in our course, we sort of begin to understand modernism as a literary exercise that tries its best to capture human imagination, to capture human consciousness. And hence we have this obsession with consciousness, this obsession with the whole idea of representing the inner workings of the mind, so to say. So all these different markers, the sensory markers, are important over here. The odorous tables, so what odorous appears twice over here. The dark dripping gardens, odors arising from the ash pits, the stables are odorous, so to speak, and shook music from the buckled harness. So again, a sense of hearing. The horse is a harness, of course, and the coachman is shaking the harness and producing music out of it. Right? So the entire movement of the voice is depicted through the sensory markers, which is obviously a very modernist technique. When we returned to the street light from the kitchen windows had filled the areas. If my uncle was seen turning the corner, we hid in the shadow until we had seen him safely housed. So this is the first figure of the adult over here, right? So the adult coming in, the adult is the enemy to the children over here. So the moment the adult appears on the scene, the children hide, right? So we hid in the corner until we see him safely housed. So the adult coming here, becoming an enemy, becoming a disturbance, this playful, ludic activity, this ludic landscape, so to say, where the children are playing together in different kind of boys' games. So the uncle is an enemy to this play. And now we have the object of desire for the boy. Or if Mangan's sister came out of the doorstep to call her brother in to tea, we watched her from a shadow peer up and down the street. We waited to see whether she would remain or go in, and if she remained, we left her shadow and walked up to Mangan's steps resignedly. So the Mangan's sister would come out and call her brother for tea,
and they would hope, the boys would hope that she'll go away, having given up on the brother, but sometimes she would stay and insist on the brother coming back. And when she did that, all the boys would go and resign, which is to say that will formally close the play for the day. Okay. She was waiting for us, her figure defined by the light from the half-open door. So again, as in Eliot, we find the descriptions over here are visually quite cinematic. So the visual grammar is very cinematic. It's a photoplay of light and shadow, which is obviously something that early cinema was very, very keen on doing. Right? So she was waiting for her figure defined by the light from the half-open door. Her brother, always teased her, before he obeyed, and stood by the railings looking at her. Her dress swung as she moved her body, and a soft rope of her hair tossed from side to side. So look at these very metonymic close-ups. Again, very, very cinematic. So the boy's eyes are falling on Mangan's sisters in different parts of her attire. The hair, the dress is swinging, and every bit has been described very metonymically. So she's never really described as a whole person. She's always focused on different fragments to different close-up techniques, and that's something which we find at the very beginning of the story. And now the focus shifts completely. So we find that this is a very good example of focalization, because whatever we get as readers is focalized to the eye of a certain narrator, right? And when that focus shifts, we also get a different kind of story. We get a different landscape because the focus has shifted, right? So it can be a close-up, it can be a long shot, it can be a panoramic view, it can be a very, very fragmented view, depending on the focus. So the focalization is important over here, and she's this particular person, the unnamed narrator, is a focalized figure through which we get to see the whole story. And now we get to know we get a more of a sort of a telescopic shot, so to speak, on Mangan's sister. Every morning, I lay on the floor in the front parlor watching her door. The blind was pulled down to within an inch of the sash so that I could not be seen. So it's almost like a voyeuristic gaze, which we see. So, the blind, he pulls the blinds down within an inch of the sash, and within this inch, between this inch, he takes a look at Mangan's door, waiting, hoping to get a glimpse of a sister. So this is completely a voyeuristic male gaze, which is in operation. When she came out of the doorstep, my heart leaped. I ran to the hall, seized my books, and followed her. I kept a brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I had never spoken to her except for a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. Okay. Now, obviously, this is an example of a boyhood crush. So he is obviously in love with her. He is fascinated by her. Obviously, sexually, there's a lot of erotic undertone in this. The brown figure appearing in his imagination, and he's just waiting for her to come out of the doorstep. And the moment he sees her, to this very voyeuristic gaze, to the slits of the Venetian blinds, he takes his books and runs just to get a glimpse of her and walked with her to the point in which the ways diverged. But the last sentence is interesting over here, because as I mentioned, this is a very, very Irish setting, a very Catholic Irish setting, where there's a lot of hypocrisy about sexuality. So the very acknowledgement of sexual impulses, the bodily impulses, is a taboo in this particular setting. And obviously this is a very middle class, or maybe perhaps a lower middle class Irish house, which is overdetermined by this consumption of religious hypocrisy. So the foolish blood over here is obviously the sexual feeling that he has for her. But the word summons is interesting because it's a really religious word, right? So the way it is described to us, her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. So it's couched in very religious rhetoric. We're actually talking about something deeply erotic, and that is the confusion we're talking about over here. And that confusion is reflective of the larger hypocrisy of the Irish society in which this boy is embedded, right? So, and that's something which you find over and over again in Dubliners as a collection. It's full of alcoholic people, it's full of hypocritical priests, it's full of stagnation, or figures of stagnation. What makes it worse is religious hypocrisy, the moral hypocrisy of this society, which is controlled by the church, this very decadent, falling church of the Irish Catholic Church in this particular case. Okay, and now we have this metaphors of the quest coming in, the metaphors of the mythic quest coming in. And as I mentioned, there is a mythic subtext, a mythic method, which is very deliberately appropriated by Joyce to talk about something very banal, right? So the whole idea over here is to go to this market called Araby and fetch something which is attractive for the girl. But the way it is described in a boy's imagination, it is no less than a quest. in his childhood, adolescent imagination. It is something of supreme significance to him. And that supremacy of significance is something which is depicted by the choice of metaphors, by the choice of markers. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Her image accompanied me even in places the most hostile to romance. On Saturday evenings, when my aunt went marketing, I had to go out to carry some of the parcels. We walked through the flaring streets, jostled by drunken men and bargaining women, amid the curses of labourers, the shrill litanies of shop boys who stood on guard by the battles of pigs' cheeks, the nasal chanting of street singers who sang a come only about Owen Donovan Rosa, or a ballad about the troubles in our native land. So if we take a look at the soundscape in Dublin over here, it's very interesting. It's got religious songs. It's also got people, drunken people shrieking. It's got bargaining women. It's got people cursing, the curses of labourers and drunkards. And then amidst all this, we have the shrill litanies of shop boys and the nasal chanting of street singers. And then there are ballads about the troubles in our native land. So it's a very difficult and decadent political situation which has been described over here. And the soundscape is very, very important because that's very reflective of the condition, the cultural condition of Ireland in which this particular story is set. But also see the way how all this converges into just one meaning for the boy, because the only meaning it has at this moment is a desire for that woman, the desire to get the attention of the woman, the love for that woman that he is beginning to feel in his adolescent body, in his adolescent imagination. These noises converge in a single sensation of life for me. I imagined that I bore my chalice safely to a throng of foes. So again, this equation of himself with the knight is interesting because obviously he's grown up consuming that kind of a narrative, whether through the church, whether through reading religious books, etc. So again, he's couching his sentimental, erotic feelings with using religious metaphors. So he imagines himself as a knight carrying a particular chalice to a throng of foes. So everyone is a foe, everyone is an enemy around him, and he is bearing this chalice with all the protection that he's capable of producing. So as to say, which is to say that he is bearing the image of his beloved in his mind, despite the very inimical conditions of labourers and drunkards and shop boys shrieking out the shrill litanies. Okay, so again, the choice of metaphor is very, very interesting. It's always a religious metaphor, even when it's talking about something very, very sexual or erotic in quality. Okay, her name sprang to my lips at moments in strange prayers and praises which I myself did not understand. So again, the strange prayers is very, very symbolic over here. It is prayer and praises, which is again religious, but then they're strange, and her name comes up in those prayers. So again, we have a very interesting entanglement of erotic and religious registers in a very confused imagination. My eyes are often full of tears. I could not tell why, and at times a flood from my heart seemed to pour itself out into my bosom. I thought little of the future. I did not know whether I could ever speak to her or not. If I spoke to her, how I could tell her of my confused adoration. My body was like a harp, and the words and gestures were like fingers running upon the wires. So again, the harp, which is essentially a religious musical instrument, and that has been described, that has been used to talk about a very, very eroticized body, a body which is very, very sexualized, a body which is beginning to feel a sexual sensation for the beloved, but that has been couched, that has been conveyed to us using very confused religious symbols, religious markers, spiritual markers, contemporary markers, which he has consumed as a boy growing up in Ireland, growing up in Dublin. So this is a very good example, this particular story. Those of you interested in MET, or material engagement theory, which is to say, how do you engage with the materiality around us? Right? So because every form of materiality is discursively produced. So the way you engage with a certain symbol, whether it's a religious symbol or a totemic symbol of any kind, is determined by your consumption of meaning in that particular setting. So harp over here, prayers over here, summons over here, chalice over here, these are all very strategic metaphors. These are markers, certain kind of sentiments for this particular boy, this Irish boy growing up in a very decadent Dublin. Okay, and now we have this very, very atmospheric scene where we have this spectrality mixing with desire. So he goes to the space where the priest had died, and it's a very symbolic scene. One evening, I went to the back drawing room in which the priest had died. So the absent priest, or the absence of religion, the absent faith, the faithless space, so to speak. Right? He goes into that particular space. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house. Through one of the broken panes, I heard the rain impinge upon the earth, the fine incessant needles of water playing in the sodden beds. Some distant lamp or lighted window gleamed below me. I was thankful I could see so little. all my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves, and feeling that I was about to slip from them, I pressed the palms of my hands together until it trembled, murmuring, "O love," many times. Now, again, this is a very, very erotic experience, but he doesn't want to acknowledge it because he cannot acknowledge it. He's not, this is a taboo for him, growing up in that kind of a setting. So everything is very religious. He goes to the dark drawing room in which a priest had died. So it is some kind of a quasi-religious space in which he wants to feel it. It's raining outside, and again, the rain seems to be something which is, it's like an incessant needle of water playing in the sodden beds, and you can see some illumination outside of his window. And also, he's thankful he could see so little because, the rest is for his imagination. He wants to imagine a certain situation. He doesn't want to see what's really there because he wants to fantasize a certain scene. So this is obviously a scene of fantasy, a scene of fantasization, so to speak. And then the last bit is interesting. All my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves, and feeling that I was about to slip away from them, I pressed the palms of my hands together until it trembled, murmuring, "O love," many times. So again, this is a very, very sexual kind of an activity. So the pressing the palms of the hand together until it trembled is an example of a certain kind of erotic sensation that he's experiencing in his body as an adolescent male. But obviously he's couching that using religious platonic metaphors, sublimating it, so to say, using a certain kind of metaphor, a rhetoric that is useful for him, that's consumed while he's growing up. "O love," many times. So it's very, very reified, it's very rhetorical, it's very performative, right? There's something that he's sublimating into a different kind of a linguistic register, right? So again, we have a very interesting combination of different kinds of registers: religious register, erotic register, sublimated register, banal registers, all coming together to produce a very confused sensation over here. Now, the last bit is interesting, and I'll stop at this point. This is suddenly it cuts into sort of clock time. At last she spoke to me. So again, look at the shortness of a sentence, the degree of finality about the sentence. At last she spoke to me. When she addressed the first words to me, I was so confused that I did not know what to answer. She asked me, was I going to Araby? I forgot whether I answered yes or no. It would be a splendid bazaar. She said she would love to go, right? So the first mention of Araby happens over here. And again, look at the very abruptness in which this entire conversation takes place. There's no introduction, there's no getting to know each other. Suddenly he's asked that whether or not he'll go to Araby, right? And that Araby becomes a metaphor over here of ideal space, a utopian space, and I forgot whether I answered yes or no. It would be a splendid bazaar, and she said she would love to go. So again, the whole attachment with Araby is interesting because Araby is then subsequently equated in his mind with a splendid space, with a utopian space, a space of desire, a space where he can go as a knight in a quest for something which will please his beloved, and he'll come back to that. So the entire story after this becomes a mythical quest, so to say, to go to Araby. And like most myths, this ends in frustration. So when he actually goes to Araby, it just turns out to be just a bazaar. It turns out to be just a space which is completely dark and banal and mundane, and that is a big disillusionment for him in terms of his romantic expectation, the comic expectation is produced in his romantic imagination. So that entire story now, from this point of time, will be about going to Araby and then failing in the quest and the frustration experience in that particular quest, which is something which completely decimates his childlike imagination. And again, just to summarize very quickly, we find this a very confused adolescent imagination which is getting more and more sexualized over here, but it is very, very confused because it's consumed a kind of religious rhetoric, religious metaphor, religious knowledge, which doesn't allow him to acknowledge sexuality in a very, very free way. It's a very repressed society, and that repression is something which is very, very clearly evident in a way. Feelings are not being acknowledged, or feelings are being confusedly articulated. There's a very lot of confusion going on in terms of how feelings are articulated and acknowledged, even by the self, not even conveyed, but the very acknowledgement of it is very, very confused acknowledgement. And that is obviously connected and relatable to the bigger structure of hypocrisy in contemporary Irish society in which the story is set. So I'll stop at this point today, and the next lecture will just move on and see how the quest for Araby is sort of conveyed to us in very symbolic, mythical terms, very deliberately, just to inflate its significance, just so when the deflation comes in the end, it becomes a very painful deflation for the boy. So I'll cover all that in the next lecture, and I'll stop at this point today. Thank you for your attention.